You cheated. And cheaters don't graduate from my school.
You cheated, and cheaters don't graduate from my school.
Principal Gerald Hutchins didn't lower his voice. He wanted the whole auditorium to hear it. 17-year-old Amara Whitfield stood at the podium, her research paper trembling in his fist, and she did not cry. She looked at him the way a person looks at weather. Something to endure, not something to fear. 300 students froze in their seats. Not one hand went up. Not one voice objected. Somewhere in the back row, a phone was already recording. Mr. Hutchins had no idea whose paper he was holding. He had no idea that 4 time zones away, in a lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 3 researchers had already cited it. He had just made the worst mistake of his career. In 4 minutes, a phone call from Massachusetts would land on his desk and end his career, though he had no way of knowing that yet. Have you ever been called a liar for something you knew deep down was undeniably right? Let me take you back. 6 weeks earlier, before any of this, before the phone in the back row, before the torn pages hit the floor, Amara Whitfield lived with her grandmother in a 2-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on the east side of town, where the dryers hummed through the floorboards like a heartbeat. Her grandmother, Ruth, ironed church clothes every Sunday morning like she was preparing a coronation robe, and she still called Amara my scholar the way other people said sweetheart. Money was thin. The refrigerator held more hope than food some weeks. Rent was $1,140 a month, split between Ruth's part-time hours at the church office and a pension that stopped stretching somewhere around the 20th of the month. Amara wore her school blazer 2 sizes too big on purpose, bought that way so it would still fit her by spring. She walked 11 blocks to school most mornings because the bus pass cost $1, 75 more than the week's budget allowed, and she used the walking time to recite formulas out loud to the sidewalk like a hymn nobody else could hear. But Amara had a composition notebook, cracked blue leather, initials RW, stamped in the corner that had belonged to her grandfather, a chemist who was never allowed to publish under his own name at the university that employed him in 1961. Ruth had kept it 40 years. She gave it to Amara the day she started high school, holding it out with both hands, the way a person holds something precious. Finish what he started, Ruth said. Ideas don't die. People just stop listening to them. Amara filled that notebook with equations on protein folding, sketched out during lunch periods while other kids traded gossip. Her chemistry teacher, Mrs. Delgado, was the only adult who noticed. She helped Amara turn scattered notebook pages into a real paper, 22 pages on a novel folding prediction method, written in the gaps between homework and grocery runs. Amara submitted it to a national student science competition. She told almost no one. She did not tell Principal Hutchins, because Principal Hutchins had never once learned her name correctly. He called her Amanda. He called her you in the back. He ran Lincoln Prep like a country club with hallways, and he had a habit of explaining, unprompted,
that scholarship kids needed to be watched more closely than other kids. Nepotism kept him employed. His brother-in-law sat on the school board and had for 11 years. 3 prior complaints against him had vanished into a drawer nobody opened. The way inconvenient things vanish when the person filing the complaint has less power than the person the complaint is about.
Teachers learned early not to escalate. Parents learned to pick their battles. Hutchins mistook the silence around him for respect. It was never respect. It was exhaustion, and it was about to run out. But what nobody in that building knew yet, not Hutchins, not the board, not even Amara herself, fully, was exactly how far that paper had already traveled beyond Lincoln Prep's front doors. Then, in April, the results came back. Amara's paper had placed, not just placed, flagged, forwarded, and requested by name by a graduate research group at MIT studying computational biology. An acceptance email sat in her inbox unread for 2 days because her family didn't yet own a laptop that could open it fast enough at home. And she'd been checking it at the school library on borrowed minutes. But what she didn't know was that the same week, an anonymous tip landed on Principal Hutchins's desk, claiming the paper was too advanced to be a student's own work. He didn't investigate. He didn't ask Mrs. Delgado. He called an assembly. Amara had brought that notebook to school for one reason. Mrs. Delgado had asked her to double-check a decimal in an equation before the competition results were formally announced. It never left Amara's backpack during class. She only pulled it out once, quietly, at her desk, 10 minutes before the assembly bell rang, and that was enough for someone to notice and mention it, and for the mention to reach Hutchins's office before lunch. That's where we started. The auditorium, the fist around the paper, 300 silent witnesses. He held the composition notebook up too, Ruth's notebook, the one with her grandfather's initials, because Amara had brought it that morning to double-check a formula. "This is where you copied it from, isn't it?" he said. Not a question, a verdict already delivered. And then, in front of everyone, in front of Mrs. Delgado standing helpless by the exit, in front of the phone, quietly recording in the back row, he tore 3 pages loose from the spine. He let them drift to the gymnasium floor like they were nothing, like 40 years meant nothing. "People like you don't write papers like this," he said. "You people find them." Amara knelt, gathered the torn pages, and said only this: "You're going to want to read that paper before you decide what it's worth." She didn't raise her voice. She never did. Calm in that gymnasium looked like defiance nobody in the room had a name for yet. It hadn't started with the torn pages. It started 10 minutes earlier, when Hutchins called Amara up to the podium and asked her, in a voice pitched for the back row, to explain in her own words how she'd written a paper that a graduate student couldn't have written. Amara tried. She walked him through the folding method, calm, specific, unhurried. He cut her off twice. He said the words needed to sound impressive were a lot of big words for someone who couldn't pass my algebra placement test, which wasn't even true. And nervous laughter moved through the freshman section before dying under the weight of the silence around it. He asked her to name her sources without looking at notes. She named them correctly for 90 uninterrupted seconds, and it was somewhere in that silence, watching 300 faces start to lean toward believing her, that Hutchins reached for the notebook sitting on the podium beside her paper. That was when it happened. Not an accident. Not a flash of temper he could later apologize for. He opened the spine slowly, found the oldest pages, and tore them out, one at a time, like he was making a point with each one. 3 pages, 40 years, gone in 11 seconds, drifting down onto gymnasium floorboards that still smelled faintly of Friday's pep rally wax. Mrs. Delgado started forward from the exit and was stopped by another staff member's hand on her arm. She was suspended that same afternoon, pending review. Mrs. Delgado tried to speak up in the front office and was told to mind her own department. Ruth found out from a neighbor before the school ever called. And in 3 days, Ruth said, "Remember that number, something is going to happen that this man cannot undo." What none of them knew was where that story had already gone. Amara's grandfather, Robert Whitfield, had spent his whole career being erased. He'd solved a folding problem in 1961 that a colleague later published under his own name, receiving tenure while Robert received a layoff notice. Ruth had watched it happen and never fully forgave the world for it. She raised her daughter and then her granddaughter on one repeated lesson: write it down anyway. Keep the notebook anyway. Somebody, someday, will read it right. She used to tell Amara, late at night, about the first idea that was ever stolen from this family, and how the theft didn't kill the idea, it only delayed it. Robert died when Amara was 9. She barely remembered his voice. What she remembered was a hospital room, and Ruth holding his hand, and Robert whispering something Ruth would repeat to Amara for the rest of her childhood. "Tell them I was right, .ide. Tell them I was right." At the time, 9-year-old Amara thought he was talking about a card game. It took her years to understand he meant the notebook. She remembered his handwriting, slanted and careful, filling the margins of that blue notebook in a chemist's shorthand nobody else in the family could read. And when she filled in her own equations beside his 40-year-old sketches. First, as a bored freshman killing time on a rainy afternoon, something in the structure lined up in a way that made the back of her neck go cold.
His unfinished folding model and her computational method were solving the same problem from 2 different decades. The MIT researchers who flagged her paper hadn't just found a talented teenager. Buried in her appendix, footnoted almost as an afterthought, was a diagram credited RW 1961. And one of the senior professors on that research team recognized the notation immediately, because he had spent 15 years trying to trace where an uncredited folding concept in his own field's early literature had actually come from. That professor's name was Dr. Elena Cho. She had spent 15 years quietly certain that somebody, somewhere, had solved half of this problem before her field ever caught up to it, and she had never been able to prove it. When Amara's paper landed in her research group's submission queue, flagged by an undergraduate reviewer who thought the appendix looked oddly old-fashioned, Dr. Cho read the footnote 3 times before she understood what she was looking at. Then she pulled up archival records from 1961, cross-referenced a name she'd never had reason to search before,
and sat alone in her office for a long time before making a single phone call. And 3 days after the assembly, Dr. Cho called the school. She didn't call to ask permission.
She called to inform Lincoln Prep that Amara Whitfield's paper was being formally incorporated into a MIT-affiliated research initiative, that the university wanted her grandfather's original 1961 notes for archival verification, and that a formal statement was being prepared with the university's communications office regarding the paper's authorship.
She asked politely and precisely why the student in question was suspended. Principal Hutchins was in his office when the call transferred to him. He picked up already annoyed. He put it down 40 minutes later, pale, and immediately requested every disciplinary file be pulled from the shared drive before end of day. It was too late. The bystander with the phone had already posted the recording, the torn pages drifting to the floor. "People like you find them," Amara's calm reply. And by that evening it had climbed past 200,000 views. By morning, past 3 million. Hashtag read the paper first was trending in the local metro area by noon. 3 days later, Dr. Cho did not send a letter. She came in person with 2 colleagues into the same gymnasium where the assembly had happened, because the school board, suddenly very interested in optics, had called an emergency public meeting there. 90 minutes. That was how long the board had originally scheduled for routine business before the meeting spiraled into something else entirely.
Parents filled seats that had been empty during the suspension hearing. Reporters stood at the back where the phone had once recorded quietly. Mrs. Delgado sat in the front row, this time refusing to be quiet. Ruth sat beside her, holding the torn pages taped carefully back into the spine of the blue notebook. Hutchins arrived 12 minutes late, adjusting his tie.
Still under the impression this was a meeting he could talk his way through. He had talked his way through 3 prior complaints. He did not know this would not be a 4th. Dr. Cho stood at that same podium. She held up Amara's paper in one hand and a photocopy of Robert Whitfield's 1961 notes in the other. "This student's method," she said,
"independently and correctly extends a folding model that our field lost track of 65 years ago, because the man who first sketched it was never allowed to publish it.
"We are naming the joint framework the Whitfield method. Both Whitfields." The room went silent in a completely different way than it had 6 weeks earlier. Then Amara walked to the front, not summoned, not permitted, simply walking the way she'd walked to gather torn pages off a gymnasium floor, and stood beside Dr. Cho. She looked directly at Principal Hutchins, seated stiffly in the front row because the board had required his attendance. She said, calm as ever, "You told me people like me find papers like this. I didn't find it. I finished it." Hutchins's face drained of every ounce of color it had. His mouth opened, then closed, the way a man's mouth moves when every version of his defense has just become evidence against him instead. He looked, for the first time in 11 years, at that podium, small, somewhere near the back. The same student who had recorded the assembly 6 weeks earlier was recording again. And this time, 300 people weren't frozen. They were on their feet. He said nothing. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't be recorded, quoted, and used against him within the hour. Within a week, the district placed Hutchins on administrative leave pending investigation. Within a month, 3 previously buried discrimination complaints resurfaced, filed years earlier by other students and teachers, all describing the same pattern: the diminishing nicknames, the presumption of guilt, the protection his brother-in-law's seat on the board had guaranteed him. A parents' coalition filed a joint civil complaint against the district for negligent oversight. The school board, facing a lawsuit it could not survive politically. accepted Hutchins's resignation in lieu of termination, and, under public pressure amplified by the viral video's 12 million views, implemented a new district-wide policy requiring any academic misconduct accusation to include a written review by 2 independent faculty members before any disciplinary action could be taken. They named it, without irony, the Whitfield Protocol. Mrs. Delgado was appointed to chair the review committee herself. The anonymous tipster was later identified as a parent whose own child had placed lower than Amara in the same competition. The district issued a formal correction and a public apology to Amara and her family, printed in the same local paper that had first covered the suspension as scandal. But the reckoning wasn't finished.
2 former teachers, both let go years earlier under circumstances the district had called budget cuts, came forward once the video hit 12 million views, describing near-identical treatment. One bilingual instructor accused, without evidence, of writing her own students' essays for them. One janitor accused of theft the week after he'd reported Hutchins for an unrelated incident, then quietly fired without a hearing. State education auditors opened a formal review of the district's disciplinary records going back 9 years. 3 settlements followed within 4 months, totaling $340,000, funded not by the district's insurance but by an emergency budget line the board had spent a decade insisting didn't exist.
A local news investigation uncovered that Hutchins's file already contained 2 prior written warnings, both signed by a superintendent who happened to golf with his brother-in-law every second Saturday. That superintendent resigned 9 days after the story ran. Hashtag Read the Paper First crossed 12 million views by the end of that month and kept climbing through the summer.
Resurfacing every time a new outlet picked up the story, CNN, then a segment on a national morning show, then, strangely and fittingly, a science communication channel that used Amara's paper itself as a teaching example for aspiring student researchers. Hutchins, for his part, gave no interviews. He moved out of state within the year. The last anyone in town heard of him, he was working in private tutoring under a slightly different first name, hoping nobody would look too closely at the Ursum. Dr. Cho's research group formally credited Robert Whitfield as co-originator of the folding framework 65 years after the fact, in a peer-reviewed paper that listed his name beside his granddaughter's.
MIT offered Amara a full research fellowship for the summer, with a standing invitation to apply the following fall. Ruth framed the acceptance letter beside a photograph of Robert at his old laboratory bench, the one he'd been quietly pushed out of. 1 year later, Lincoln Prep opened its first-name scholarship fund, the Whitfield Fellowship for First-Generation Researchers, seeded by $180,000 in donations that poured in after the video, matched by MIT's own outreach office. The fellowship covers lab supplies, application fees, and the line Ruth insisted be written into the charter herself, 1 notebook per student. No exceptions. Amara, home for winter break from her freshman year at MIT, was the one who read the first 2 winning essays aloud at the ceremony. Both winners were freshmen. One of them, a shy boy named Devin, who'd written about his father's unfinished engineering degree, started crying halfway through his own essay, and Amara simply stood beside him at the podium, saying nothing until he found his voice again. She didn't tell either of them to be angry. She told them to keep writing it down anyway, because somebody, eventually, reads it right, even if it takes longer than anyone thinks is fair. Mrs. Delgado, still chairing the district's new review committee, keeps a printed copy of the original torn pages, taped back together, framed on her classroom wall, not as a trophy, she says, but as a reminder of exactly how close the truth came to never being read at all.
Dr. Cho's lab now runs an annual outreach program specifically for public high schools in underfunded districts, screening student research for exactly the kind of overlooked self-taught brilliance that almost got buried in a gymnasium. 3 other student papers have been forwarded to university labs since the program launched.
Ruth sat in the front row of that scholarship ceremony in a school gymnasium that finally deserved her granddaughter, holding the blue notebook, its torn pages taped, its story finished, not stolen, finished. 65 years late, but finished all the same. She still calls Amara my scholar. She always will. If this story moved you, take a second before you go. Like it! Share it with somebody who needs to hear it today, and subscribe if you want more stories like this one. And if you haven't yet, go back and watch the moment Amara kneels to gather those torn pages off the gymnasium floor. Watch her hands, She doesn't shake once. Here's the question I'll leave you with. When has the world underestimated you for exactly the reasons it should have paid closer attention? And here's what really gets me about this one. It's not the reversal. It's not even the standing ovation Amara never asked for. It's that her grandfather did everything right in 1961 and still lost. Quietly, completely, with no gymnasium, no viral video, no fellowship named in his honor while he was alive to see it. It took 65 years, one cruel afternoon in a gymnasium, and a girl who refused to raise her voice to finally put his name back where it belonged. Somewhere out there, somebody is holding on to their own version of that blue notebook right now, waiting for permission that was never actually required, telling themselves their idea isn't ready, or isn't theirs to claim, or will be taken more seriously once someone with more letters after their name says so first. It won't. It rarely does. Somebody has to finish it anyway. So let me ask you something more personal than the first question. What's the idea you're still keeping in a drawer, waiting for someone else to say it's good enough? Tell me in the comments. I read every one.